If we had fought back, many of us would have been killed on the spot.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me.
Hey, Thomas, I saw you outside of a burning bus, man.
Several years ago, the Stetson University College of Law established an elective course on the subject of constitutional law and the civil rights movement. The course begins with an examination of Alexis de Tocqueville's commentary in 1835 on the subject of the unique character of slavery in America, and then includes readings related to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction-era Civil Rights Acts, the slaughterhouse cases, the civil rights cases, and most importantly, Plessy versus Ferguson and the era of separate but equal and Jim Crow laws. Students then examine the prominent cases leading up to Brown versus Board of Education, including Smith versus Allwright and Morgan versus Virginia, and then engage in an extended discussion of the Supreme Court's decisions in Brown versus Board of Education. And after that, the judicial decisions and direct action campaign which attempted to advance the principle of equality announced in Brown versus Board. But beyond these cases, the students are studying the movement itself, the structure of the movement, its philosophy of nonviolent protest, and the interplay between federal and state government and the efforts of civil rights activists in the struggle to implement Brown's mandate and achieve social justice. Recent revisionist history and legal scholarship have contributed significantly to the classroom presentation of this subject, and so the classroom course itself is an important part of a law student's understanding of the importance of the Civil War amendments and could be considered a satisfactory educational experience. But in 2005, my conversations with my colleague Professor James Fox of our faculty and Professor Ray Arsenault of the University of South Florida convinced me that law students should be exposed to a learning experience that would be more intellectually diverse and more personally meaningful. The subject is, after all, a people's history, suited to the storytelling approach pioneered by Professor Derek Bell, and a natural laboratory for the study of the role of law in a human rights struggle which has a still living legacy to which law students may be directly and personally exposed.
I've taught civil rights history on and off, or pretty regularly actually, for more than 20 years. And I can remember, early on thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually take the students on a civil rights tour, preferably in the Deep South, to some of the major sites of the movement. And so when the opportunity came along, to join forces with Stetson University College of Law, to mix graduate students and a few undergraduates and law students to take a tour like this, I jumped at the chance. I mean, I thought it was a wonderful opportunity. You can show Eyes on the Prize to your students. You can try to make your lectures, your seminars as dramatic as possible, but there's no substitute for actually having them come face to face with movement veterans, to see the actual ground, or in some cases the hallowed ground, where civil rights activists sort of stood their ground in a sense, and made the choices that changed all of our lives.
And so Professor Arsenault and I embarked on such an effort in the summers of 2006 and 2007. With resources that included audio and video facilities on our bus, and an academic itinerary which would take our students to the places and people that had been the subject of our readings and classroom discussions. The interdisciplinary team teaching aspect of the directed study was essential, And the ongoing focus provided by Professor Arsenault was essential to the students' understanding of the historical events which played out in the legal history of the Civil Rights Acts. Our 8-day journey covered 2,000 miles. Our route, rather than the sequence of the dates of events, influenced our itinerary to some extent. But the historiography to which the students had been exposed had not presented the subject in the order of dates in time, so the efficiency of our route presented no difficulty as we approached our experience in teaching and learning. Our journey took us from Gulfport, Florida, to Albany and Atlanta, Georgia, and then to Nashville, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma. In 2007, we were able to introduce an important addition to the students' learning experience. Reverend B. Elton Cox, one of the first 13 Freedom Riders, and the petitioner in Cox versus Louisiana, joined us for the entire 8-day directed study. In the context of the Freedom Rides, Reverend Cox's courage and commitment is illustrated by the account of his leadership of the July 1961 ride from St. Louis to New Orleans in Chapter 9 of Professor Arsenault's book, and the students had read of this experience. Sponsored by the St. Louis chapter of CORE, Reverend Cox and the other 4 riders encountered several hundred white protesters on July 10 at a Little Rock bus terminal. Although appearing to recognize the mandates of the Supreme Court's decision in Boynton versus Virginia, local police arrested the riders when they entered a part of the terminal reserved for white intrastate passengers, a tactic of resistors of the movement who knew that Boynton had been decided. Ignoring legal arguments supported by Boynton, the trial judge convicted Reverend Cox and others under state breach of the peace laws. Later in the movement, Reverend Cox would endure 17 arrests. His ultimate victory in the United States Supreme Court in Cox versus Louisiana was an important step in the protection of the exercise of free speech and associational rights during the protests against segregation. The route of our itinerary took us first to Albany, Georgia. As we traveled to Albany, the students viewed No Easy Walk, the Eyes on the Prize chapter that captures the essence of the Albany movement. Once in Albany, the students immediately experienced being in a movement church, which served as the center of civil rights movement activity. Albany would be the first of several visitations of movement churches, and it would be the place where we met Rutha Harris, an original Albany freedom singer and movement activist. Rutha Harris explained the origin and importance of freedom songs, and our students' first personal identification with the history they had studied was the experience of studying freedom songs with Rutha Harris.
Oh, freedom.
Oh, freedom.
Oh, freedom.
Oh, freedom.
Over me.
Over me.
And before I to be a slave.
Before I be a slave.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Over me. And before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free, and be free.
This was the first time they began to personally feel the emotion of movement history, and how that emotion sustained the direct action campaign when the mass arrests began. With freedom songs fresh in their minds, Albany then became our first experience in the observation of movement photography and historical monuments as ways of teaching and preserving legal history. This first experience included the exhibits in the Albany Civil Rights Museum itself, which is still small and intimate, and a visit to Charles Sherrod Park, named in honor of the young and vibrant leader of the Albany student movement, who is featured in No Easy Walk. The appropriate first experience in Atlanta was, of course, the Martin Luther King Center.
Notice the Gandhian theme throughout. Sort of King is the American Gandhi. Was wonderfully fitting sculpture here of Mohandas Gandhi.
I woke up this morning with my mind was set.
Its state-of-the-art multimedia environment includes the powerful use of documentary film, still photography, sculpture, and memorabilia. These mediums allowed the students to visualize in one setting the life of Dr. King and who he was as a person. The concept of nonviolence as central to his leadership of the movement.
I'm walking and talking with my mind. Was stay on freedom. I'm walking and talking with my mind. Stay on freedom. Stay on freedom. I'm walking and talking with my mind. Stay on freedom. Stay on freedom. Hallelujah. 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 I'm holding walk, yeah. Walk with your mind.
The impact of sitting in the Ebenezer Baptist Church and feeling the connection with him, a personal connection, while sitting at the reflection pool.
You've gotta talk.
The King Center's theme of nonviolent social change was particularly meaningful for law students who had read and contemplated the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr and Charles Houston and Dr. King himself about the role of the law and lawyers.
The importance of Martin King was not that he could speak, was as important as that was. What was important that he had a new strategy and made it work. And that strategy allowed us to really be free as we would actively become free.
Following our experience at the King Center, we held our first panel discussion at the Shrine of the Black Madonna. This was the students' first opportunity to meet 6 of the 1961 Freedom Riders and to experience legal history through the medium of original storytelling. Professor Arsenault, who had interviewed each of them for his book, facilitated a first-person discussion of the idea for the Freedom Rides, why each had made the decision to become a part of the rides, and some of the details of their first encounter with Southern resistance, including mob violence and later the mass arrests. My questions focused on the fact that these 1961 Freedom Rides were essentially supported by the Supreme Court's decision in the Irene Morgan case, and more specifically, by the court's more recent decision in Boynton versus Virginia. The students had read Professor Arsenault's explanation that the riders were instructed to state, if confronted, that what they were doing was supported by the court's decision in Boynton. But hearing the riders personally emphasize to the students how they felt when they realized that the law was simply ignored took the teaching of constitutional law up a notch. Charles Person was the youngest of the original 13 Freedom Riders who boarded the first bus on May 4, 1961. A freshman at Morehouse College, Charles Person was a gifted student of math and physics who had been denied admission to Georgia Tech. He was a member of the student-based Atlanta Committee on Civil Rights.
We used to picket and do all those kinds of things, and CORE sent out a request for the Freedom Rides. Well, I didn't know about the Journey of Reconciliation or anything about a Freedom Ride, but anything that was going to make life better, I wanted to be a part of it. Well, Lonnie King, after we got beat up and stuff, Lonnie went and told my parents that everything was basically all right, and they just had to wait to see. And because I had the little patch on my head, and plus the way the news played it up, and everybody remembers the bus that was burning, and they just, well, you're on the one that was burning. No, I was not. I was on the other bus. So.
Larry Hunter was an 18-year-old student at Tennessee State University on the May 28, 1961 Trailways ride from Nashville to Montgomery to Jackson, and was among the youngest riders to be jailed in Mississippi.
Well, strangely enough, as it seems, this is my hero, Hank Thomas.
Why is that strange?
Because, Hank, I saw you outside of a burning bus, man. And at that time, they were trying to convince us, the students in Nashville, to end this thing called a Freedom Ride. And I saw this guy, and I said, hey, if he can do it, I can do it, you know.
Hank Thomas, a 19-year-old Howard University student when he joined the first Freedom Ride as a last-minute substitute for his roommate, appears in the cover photograph of Professor Arsenault's book as he stood outside the burned-out bus at Anniston. The story of his leadership role in the July 1961 ride, retracing the original journey of reconciliation, and his later trial by Hinds County, Mississippi Judge Russell Moore are definitive moments in the Freedom Ride story. Ignoring the arguments of Thomas's legendary civil rights attorney William Kunstler, Judge Moore held that federal law, including the Boynton decision itself, had no application to the breach of the peace allegations against Thomas. Hank Thomas's trial is a classic illustration of a legal system controlled by white supremacist philosophy that saw the violation of local custom as illegal activity, despite the protections of the federal Constitution and the Supreme Court's decision in Morgan and Boynton. A survivor of Mississippi's Parchman Prison Farm, Hank Thomas has used the lessons of the movement's ultimate success to build a notable career in business leadership.
We often talk about some people, let's say like John Lewis or Reverend Jim Lawson, thinking about nonviolence as a whole philosophy of life. There are others who think of it more as a tactic or a strategy, and just wonder where you think you fall along that spectrum.
For me, it was a tactic, and I understand better now why it was a tactic. We had to do it, and now I understand, for practical reasons. Number one, if we had fought back, many of us would have been killed on the spot. If you had defended yourself when 4 or 5 guys are beating you up, when the police got there, they would have shot you. There's no doubt about it. And also, for I think most Americans, most white Americans at that time, when they saw what was happening, they knew it was wrong, and many of them knew that segregation was wrong. And it was easier to identify with us if we're not making it difficult for them to make a decision. A lot of folks today don't know of the contributions, obviously, of a lot of white folks of goodwill, the freedom struggle down in Mississippi on the Freedom Ride. There were regional Freedom Ride. There were 13 of us. 7 of those 13 were white, and 4 of them were Jews. And I usually start off by saying, and just last month I spoke to a Jewish cultural group of black teenagers and Jewish teenagers, and I start off by saying, lest I forget thee, O Jerusalem. I never want people to forget the contribution that Jews made to our struggle. They didn't have to do it, and in most instances, they suffered more physical abuse than we did when we were walking the picket line.
Well, mine sort of both, a tactic and a way of life. Tactic on the Freedom Ride, yes, but after leaving jail that summer, spent the summer in Nashville protesting various things all over the city. And it became clear to me that nonviolence really would have to sort of start being a way of life. Coming within an inch of my life one night on a picket line, it became very clear to me.
An original Freedom Rider while a freshman at Tennessee State, Bill Harbour has also been the spokesman for recognition of students who were expelled from the university for their participation in the civil rights movement. This part of his work is important to law students who have studied the Fifth Circuit's decision in Dixon versus Alabama State Board of Education and the seminal application of the Due Process Clause to protect students from retaliatory expulsion for the exercise of constitutionally protected speech. Bill Harbour became a close friend of John Lewis and a survivor of Parchman Prison Farm, the terrible mob attacks in Montgomery that seriously injured Lewis, Jim Zwerg, and John Siegenthaler, and the mob that confronted Dr. King and the mass meeting following those attacks at the First Baptist Church, all vividly retold in Chapter 6 of Professor Arsenault's book.
In Mississippi, they made their own laws. We got off the bus and walked inside the bus station. They took us to jail, and the next day, that Monday morning, we was before a judge for breach of peace. And just for those 10 minutes inside that white side of the bus station cafeteria, I got 69 days sentenced in prison, $200 fine at that time. So I spent 49 days of those 69 days in prison for 10 minutes inside the white side of the bus station. That's what the judge gave us. The only time I really felt that the administration, especially the Kennedys at that time, had a hesitant feeling that we was down in we left Birmingham on the bus and going to Montgomery. That's when all the blood went down, streamed down the street. The gym, everybody got beat up so bad. We had a mass meeting a couple days later, and it was in a church. And that night, the Klan, everybody, they would turn over cars. You could see through the stained glass windows, fire, cars burning, and so forth. Dr. King was there, and we had a lot of the dignitaries that were downstairs on the phone with the Kennedys and also the governor of Alabama, and he said that he didn't give a damn about the agitators, they weren't going to do anything about it. And they had hid us up in the choir. I remember John Lewis up in the choir with his patch up here. They knew he was a Freedom Rider. But they had hid us, and later that night, about 3 o'clock that morning, 3 or 4 o'clock that morning, the President of the United States called down. They deputized the National Guard. They came in with those big trucks. And
declare martial law.
Martial law, right.
Right, they declare
bandits and the guns. Soldiers came in, took us out of the church, and took us to certain houses in the community so we could stay there overnight.
If you think for a moment about the white supremacists that you were up against, I think there were two things that they wanted to make you feel. They wanted you to make you feel inferior, convince you that they believed that you were inferior and that you should believe it. And they wanted to make you afraid. The whole intimidation of the legal justice system and of vigilantes. And I just wonder if you can remember what was going through your mind.
I always thought about those who had fought before and got me to the point that I was at that time. And if I didn't do anything, I would go back and not move forward.
When I was a young man here in Atlanta in school, I excelled academically, and as a young man, I was interested in things that, quote unquote, they said black people shouldn't be interested in. For instance, at a very young age, I was a ham radio operator. I never really had a sense of inferiority to anyone in my life, and I really never had any fear on the Freedom Ride. I remember the Sunday that we were leaving Montgomery and being escorted to the state line of Mississippi. I remember the bus feeling kind of warm as we neared the state line, but that didn't bring any fear into me. The only thing that I noticed what Mississippi did, after the president got on John Patterson, who was the governor of Alabama at that time, he escorted this bus to the state line, you know. But when we hit Mississippi, things changed. Mississippi would only station a car like every 10 miles, you know. You would see a car off the side of the road. I noticed that, but I still wasn't fearful. I might have been naive, you know, but I had no fear.
Charles?
You know.
It's amazing. I wouldn't call it fear because I don't think any young people have fear. But I think it's amazing how singing kind of fortified. I could deal with anything. We would start a meeting or a march, and we'd always start the day off with prayer. But we would sing, and whatever fear that may have been there, you know, it was gone. I mean, you know, I'd walk into a lion's den. It didn't matter because I was fortified.
Well, I would say that in civil rights historiography and the field of civil rights studies, one of the most difficult things to achieve is a balance between an appreciation for the law as an agent of social change and the so-called movement culture. They're looking at the kind of long history of case law and of constitutional law related to civil rights, and then they're meeting the people who pressured the legal system, who were either defendants or plaintiffs in some cases, but who certainly were the ones trying to push the pace of legal and political and legislative change.
The very first panel discussion at the Shrine of the Black Madonna introduced us to a first-hand account of the relationship between the law and the Direct Action Campaign, and the personalities of the movement veterans we had read about in both the assigned cases and our 2 assigned texts. Hank Thomas's personal description of being jailed allowed us to experience how he felt about a law and order mentality that jailed him in disregard of Supreme Court law. Hearing him tell us about this experience gave me a sense of being in that moment.
As we left Atlanta, a new experience awaited us in Anniston. With storytelling still fresh, we found ourselves pulling up to the same Greyhound bus station where the first Freedom Riders were attacked by a Klan-inspired white mob. With the actual site as our classroom, the students interacted with Professor Arsenault and Reverend Cox about the violence of Southern resistance defined by the attacks in Anniston, the subject of Chapter 4 of Freedom Riders.
You're not quite in the Black Belt here, and historically across the South, communities and counties which were between 40 and 60% black, not quite in the Black Belt, were where you found most of the lynchings, most of the interracial violence, where there was a real possibility that blacks could be in the political majority. They really had a presence, and yet it wasn't so great as it might be in the Mississippi Delta or in the Black Belt, where blacks were 85 or 90%, where they could generally forestall the worst excesses of violence most of the time. But there was a lot of interracial tension here.
You know, we were talking on the bus about how when the bus pulled into here, you know, that Sunday morning, it was Mother's Day. You know, I was just kind of wondering what was going through the people's minds when they came through here. I'm pretty sure they talked to you about it.
See, I went back home for Mother's Day service, and after my church service, I called Reverend Fred Shellsworth and gave him my Eastern Airlines arrival time. He said, well, it just burned the bus 2 hours ago. I said, well, I'm still coming, you know.
Nashville was important to our directed study on a number of levels. First, the Nashville movement itself produced a remarkable leadership by the movement's youngest activists and showcases the role of Tennessee State University and Fisk University in the student movement. It was a center for the training of movement activists generally in the techniques of nonviolence and the training of the Freedom Riders themselves. And it was itself a study of the attempts to desegregate lunch counters, movie theaters, and other places of public accommodation, movement activity distinct from but related to the Freedom Rides. Our host, Kwame Lillard, graduated from Tennessee State University at the age of 22 and is an expert on its role in the movement. A sit-in veteran while at Tennessee State and devoted disciple of Reverend James Lawson, he became known for his work with Diane Nash in the training of scores of Freedom Riders, and for his daring rescue of Catherine Burks and John Lewis at the Tennessee line, where they had been put out along the road late at night by Birmingham's Bull Connor. Kwame Lillard would later serve for 4 years on the Nashville City Council, and today he remains an irrepressible critic of those who would say that the legacy of the movement is one of total success. Ernest Rip Patton, a Tennessee State University student, and Matthew Walker, a student at Fisk University, joined the Freedom Rides in Montgomery on May 23, 1961, to continue the ride following the white attacks at First Baptist Church on the night of May 21. Both had high regard for Reverend Lawson and Dr. King as moral centers of the movement and are unwavering in their conviction that Dr. King was personally committed to the Freedom Rides.
So you can go over what role this university played. This is a land-grant university, and it's been around since 1912. And it provided, contrary to most public information, it provided most of the student warriors, like to call them, male and female, for the Nashville movement in the 3 phases that the Nashville movement had. We were part of the initial regime, the initial phase, 60 through 62. The Freedom Rides were I think Ray's book talks about it as the first really non-local push to create a movement for justice in America. I think Montgomery was a local city, you know, and sit-ins were local, but the Freedom Ride was across state lines and involved the national government, involved Kennedy's administration, involved Hoover. So we like to think of that as a real first test to see if America was going to be America. Of course, Kennedy brothers weren't really happy, obviously. They were involved with the Bay of Pigs and involved with negotiations with the great evil empire, Russia, and they didn't want us to interfere with that, to embarrass them. And many times we felt that the issue was you Americans first, and help us maintain our status as a bastion of freedom while we're working and dealing with these evil Russians, communists, and we knew that. But obviously, it didn't bother us the fact that you got dirt in your house, and you're going to tell everybody how to keep your house clean. So our emphasis was, how do we make you clean your house up? And oftentimes, as students, I don't think it was our concern that you had to negotiate with the evil empire in Reykjavik, Iceland. We're talking about a bus station in Montgomery, Alabama.
I was involved. I was one of the first groups to leave Nashville traveling to Montgomery, which was actually, I think, the second group to leave from Nashville. The first group consisted of 13 riders, what we call the original 13 to leave Nashville. I was in the very second group to leave Nashville. I learned today that there were 5 of us in a car. Hear what I said? I learned this today, that there were 5 of us in a car, and I found out that Matthew was one of the 5. We were the first group to go in after the mobbing in Montgomery with Jim Swerg, John Lewis, and others. We were their relief. And we were really concerned because that group is the one that started it all over again. When CORE left Birmingham going to New Orleans, knowing that what had happened to them in Alabama, that it would be worse in Mississippi, when they flew to New Orleans and called back and said, it's too dangerous, don't do it. We're gonna stop right here. And a young lady by the name of Diane Nash says, no, we're not gonna stop. They had the National Guards to go from the bus terminal in Montgomery all the way to the state line. Then the bus stopped. That was the only time the bus stopped, because then the Mississippi National Guards had to carry the bus on into Mississippi, and you had the helicopters and all the National Guard, and you had National Guards on the buses. I don't know what they thought was going to happen on the bus, because there were only Freedom Riders. There were no regular passengers, just Freedom Riders and the National Guards. And we pulled into Jackson, and some people didn't even have a chance to sit down, and I was one of them. I walked into the terminal, and the man immediately said, "You're under arrest," and turned around and took me out and put me in the wagon and off to jail. One of the things about the first 26 people to be jailed in Jackson was that we were booked in the city jail. One of the things that we learned here in Nashville was to fill the jails. When we filled the city jails, they moved us to the county jails so that they could make room for more riders. We filled city and county jails. So they moved that first 26 group to the county farm. They're moving us because they're trying to decide, what do we do with these people while this jail is filling up? They moved us back to the county jail for a few days, and the next thing we know, we're on our way to Parchman, Mississippi, the state penitentiary.
What sticks in my mind is Hinds County Jail. We were in Hinds County Jail for a while, and I do remember, and I was saying this to one of the people here a little earlier today, one of the people in Hinds County Jail, I know you've met Hank Thomas. Hank was in there with us. We went on a hunger strike to protest the fact that they'd arrested us in the first place. The Kennedy administration didn't do anything about the enforcement of interstate laws, and they allowed the arrest to take place.
Each of the symposium speakers emphasized the role of Reverend Kelly Miller Smith in the Nashville movement. After earning his Master of Divinity degree from Howard University, Kelly Miller Smith came to Nashville in 1951 to become pastor of Nashville's First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill. In 1955, as president of the Nashville chapter of the NAACP, he joined 12 other black parents in a federal desegregation lawsuit against the Nashville Public School District. In 1958, he founded the Nashville Christian Leadership Council, which played the prominent role in desegregating Nashville's lunch counters, hotels, and theaters.
So, and this is 54 now is when he came, right? So from 54 to 60, I got baptized every Sunday in a God of power, a God of possibility, a God of righteousness, right? And I had no concept that when it came to making my first move on February 13, 1960, that there's nothing, no power on this earth can stop us. Because Kelly had laid it out to me. And then there were other ministers. I mean, you gotta understand that even though we were in the front, there were these icons of black men. That you stay on course, you stay focused, you follow your training, you look out for who's in front of you, and you understand that this great cause can't be stopped. It was this incredible cascade of truth that we were armed with, that we knew nothing could stand in its way.
The fact is, this movement started in Nashville with a few Fisk students who happened to attend some nonviolent workshops, which began at the church which I still attend, Clark Memorial United Methodist Church. Jim Lawson held those workshops there. Those workshops are what led to the sit-ins, and the sit-ins incorporated people from all the schools in Nashville as time went on. One of the things that isn't said, that should be said as much in terms of leadership with the movement in Nashville, is that after a few sit-ins had taken place, one of the reasons being that since it was downtown, Kelly Miller Smith's church became the focus of the movement. Kelly is not appreciated because he put his church, he put his career, he put his whole congregation on the line by making his church the premier focal point of the movement. Mass meetings, most of them were initially held at First Baptist Capitol Hill, which no longer stands today. It's been replaced by a new structure. But Kelly's church was the focus of the movement. Kelly was, in many instances, the chief spokesman for the movement.
And there was something unique about Nashville. The Greensboro movement was on February 1st. The first 4 students from A&T University caused the ripple to start. But the Nashville movement was so powerful in terms of its spectrum of leaders and its spectrum of philosophy as Matthew says, in the spectrum of skills. In the TSU 14 that were expelled, there were engineers, biologists. Fear just wasn't there. The only thing we were fearing of, do we have enough time to attack as many targets as there is available? You know, that was only fear. Do we have enough time? And to me, I recall I needed 2 more hours every day.
I had my first nonviolent direct action movement in Peoria, Illinois in 1947. Up South, as we now call it, right, also had racism, except that there was already a law designed for you that was in your favor, right? The policeman could not come in and beat you out of a store, but the mores is what was keeping racism going in the North. The reaction to that began in trying to find, how do we deal with this? How do you deal not with the law as law, but how do you deal with the mores and make it change? In Chicago, Jim Farmer through churches now, right? See, the religious entity was always there, right? And religious folk were always involved. CORE did the first big time, solid group, organized attack on racism, racist institutions, and it was through restaurants. But here again, what you found is this is where average people had to suffer, and it was average people you were going to have to organize. As we moved into the South, the conflict between states' rights and the Constitution, backed by Southern political power, is what kept us in bondage in the South in particular. The whole Southern legal process that ended always with stick violence, club violence, all right, was called law. We fought against all of that. That was absolutely necessary to see, to understand the meaning of the movement, why it existed at all.
Years ago at Stanford, I was influenced by a Native American professor who taught us how very important the oral tradition was from the dawn of man. And this experience brought me back to that. With the oral tradition, we continue to learn from the movement folks, and we don't lose these stories that may have been lost otherwise.
Following our symposium at Tennessee State University, Kwame Lillard took us on a walking tour of the principal area of the Nashville sit-ins. Walking this area of Nashville allowed the students to view the reality of an evolving urban redevelopment that has sacrificed the downtown establishments that were the locus in quo of the Nashville movement. The places where demonstrations, pickets, and sit-ins protesting the segregation of places of public accommodation are gone. And in their place are the fading markers commemorating the momentous events that are still deeply meaningful to movement veterans.
In Nashville, I think there are many sites, but one of the most moving, really, I think, is the Nashville Public Library's Civil Rights Room. You wouldn't expect, I think, to find something like that perhaps in a public library. But Nashville, of course, was a center of movement activity. It really doesn't have too many external sites. There's really no major museum in the way that there is in Memphis and in Birmingham or even in Montgomery. But there's a lot of compensation in what they've done at the Nashville Public Library, which is one of the great public libraries in the United States, but they've set aside a significant part of the library with remarkable collections of photographs, of documentary films, of published archives. They have got a huge collection, and there are large clipping files of some of the major figures of the Nashville movement. What they've done there is provided a wonderful space, and so when you take law students and graduate students there, I think, of course, they're accustomed to being in libraries and looking at sort of the written side of things. So it's a little bit different than other parts of the tour that we've done with the students, but I think it's like a wonderful haven for them, in a sense, that I noticed that we almost couldn't get them out of there, that they didn't want to stop watching the documentary films, most of them about the Nashville movement, and they were, leafing through the books, and they're looking at these extraordinary photographs, and I can see why they had such a great experience there.
At Vanderbilt University, the students were able to meet John Siegenthaler and Gene Policinski and participate in their discussion of the Kennedy administration's role in movement events and the influence of the media in bringing national attention to the movement. As all students of the subject know, John Siegenthaler is an internationally acclaimed journalist who left journalism briefly in the early 1960s to serve in the U.S. Justice Department as administrative assistant to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. The students were experienced readers of this subject, but the interview with Mr. Siegenthaler allowed them to gain an instinctive appreciation for the relationship between Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, and the urgency of the events which demanded federal executive leadership in the moment. Gene Policinski, a veteran newspaper, radio, and television journalist, is Vice President and Executive Director of the First Amendment Center. His career has included service as correspondent in the Gannett News Service Washington Bureau, reporting on Congress, politics, and other issues, and as Washington editor of USA Today during its developmental period. I asked Gene to begin our discussion with a brief history of the First Amendment and the right to protest for civil rights.
1791, we get the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and it wasn't long after that, really, that in terms of the civil rights movement, if you will, that it came into play. The first petition by an organized group of African Americans in the United States to Congress was a request for the abolition of slavery, in 1797. Interestingly, Congress refused to accept it. The explanation at the time was that they would not accept petitions from non-citizens, and so it was rejected. It was very crucial to allow the abolitionist movement to flower. The idea that you could speak and that you could protest and petition the government for redress of grievances. You could trace this through a number of the five freedoms. Some of the first journals, Freedom's Journal was published in 1827. It circulates in 11 states and the District of Columbia. In 1827 through about 1839, there were a series of freemen's meetings, which are mock congresses, if you will, including, I believe, one in Nashville, which are an attempt by individuals excluded from the normal process of law, if you will, and certainly the right of representation, to prod Congress. And it's part of that growing abolitionist movement. If you can trace the history of the abolitionist movement to any particular subjects or mechanisms, it's really the ability to publish freely without government restraint, to begin to touch the conscience of the nation. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison publishes The Liberator, which is the first publication, at least in this version of history, to unequivocally call for the abolition of slavery, an immediate end. And the Georgia legislature, in response, actually adopts a resolution offering $5,000 to anybody who could bring Garrison to the state for trial on sedition or treason charges. But you begin to see women and the suffrage movement. John has done great research on the suffrage movement, but you begin to see those two movements kind of growing out of the same First Amendment right, again, to petition for grievances, to gather, to assemble together people of like mind. Some of the early abolition movements actually had women as leaders of that movement. Maria Stewart in 1832 in Boston launches a career as a pamphleteer, heading up one of the first abolition movements in Boston to have a biracial group. And again, government was powerless to some degree to keep these from being formed, to keep these voices from being heard.
Following our review of the history of the First Amendment, I asked John Siegenthaler to bring us forward to the first meeting between Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King and the initial clash of idealism and pragmatism as a young Kennedy administration assumed the responsibility for the advancement of civil rights.
In April 1961, the administration is 3 months old. Kennedy had carried 5 southern states. already the two brothers, the President and the Attorney General, are thinking about re-election. Robert Kennedy is, from the outset and always, his brother's lightning rod. And so he suggested that the movement focus its thrust on voter registration. Dr. King that day was the ultimate idealist. It was a very friendly meeting, a very cordial meeting, even a warm meeting. And he said he understood that there was no federal police force. And he understood that the FBI was not quite often very helpful. But he said, from my perspective, I have to confront the evil of racism wherever it exists and however it exists. In other words, what he is saying to Kennedy is, I'm not going to come in front of the courthouse and limit our demonstrations there. I mean, we will protest segregation in restrooms or on public conveyances, in schools and jobs, across the board, everywhere. And I will do it in such a way that it's going to make news. If I'm going to prick the conscience, I'm paraphrasing, but the thrust of what he's saying is I have to dramatize this so that the country can understand the depth of the evil. And they parted friends. And I took notes at that meeting, and I felt that just that way. Bob Kennedy came across as the ultimate pragmatist. Dr. King came across as the ultimate idealist. I should say that 30 days later, Robert Kennedy made his first public speech. He chose Law Day at the University of Georgia. You might take a look at Charlene Hunter Galt's book. She and Hamilton Holmes had been admitted the previous September until riots broke out and school authorities denied them admission to the University of Georgia at Athens, quote, for your own protection. And the court upheld that. The district court upheld that. They appealed it, and in January, they were admitted to great violence on the campus. Robert Kennedy said, I'm going to make that first speech at the University of Georgia, and it's going to be a civil rights speech. And it was a very tough speech. And Charlene Hunter Galt, who is a journalist, has said what a thrill it was to sit in that audience. Kennedy points her out and says the whole world acknowledges now that the University of Georgia has finally taken a step of which it can be proud. And then he goes on to say, I have to tell you, my brother carried this state. We are going to enforce the civil rights laws regardless of the politics. I'm the Attorney General. We're going to enforce the civil rights laws. And again, he's passionate and powerful and eloquent. Half that house sat on its hands when he was finished, and the other half gave him a standing ovation. That's 30 days after he has the meeting with Dr. King, 30 days after his speech at Georgia. Freedom Rides force him to take the step to send in the United States Marshals to keep the peace after the Freedom Riders were attacked.
A particularly compelling part of the history of the civil rights movement is, of course, John Siegenthaler's personal experience in Montgomery with the violent nature of Southern resistance. Professor Arsenault and I asked Mr. Siegenthaler to share his personal recollection of that experience with the students.
You know about the story. I went down there simply to help that first wave. That first group flies into New Orleans that night, and state police and local cops form a cordon. You didn't walk off an airplane into the terminal in those days. There's no jetway. There were racist slurs from the mouths of police officers every step along that way from the airplane to the bus terminal. Anyway, they got there and their friends welcomed them, and midnight later, Attorney General calls and another wave is started down from Nashville. Finally, John Patterson, the governor, meets with me. It's a confrontation. He lectures me. And I never have a chance for 15 minutes to say a word in response. It is hammer, hammer, hammer. And the mob met the Freedom Riders at the bus station that day. Violent mob. John Lewis and Jim Zwerg are mauled, bloodied. Journalists with cameras were assaulted first. The young women on that bus were the last, I think, to come off. And they went to a taxi driver, and two of them were white. And the cab driver is African American. Said, I can't give a ride, I'll be arrested, they'll take my license away. And so these two young women start out on their own. The cab leaves, and they are set upon almost by a satellite crowd. And I'm circling the block and come down, and they're Susan Wilbur and Susan Herman were their names. One of them was being pummeled pretty badly, and I thought there was a chance to get them both in the car, and got out and tried to help both of them. And in trying to get them in the car, one of them resisted because she was afraid I was going to get hurt, and she was trained to be nonviolent. And that came that pause, and unfortunately they wheeled me around, and I said, "Get back, I'm federal government," and I was hit in the head with a pipe and knocked unconscious. Never been knocked unconscious. They let the mob run wild for 30 minutes. I was out for 25 minutes. 25 minutes I was out.
In the next segment of our discussion, we asked John to talk with us a bit about the clash of the politics of Southern resistance and the philosophy of young movement activists.
So by the time the sit-ins are over, and by the time I go to the Justice Department, it's clear to me that the movement is going to go on, and that ultimately Southern politicians are going to have to come to grips with the reality of people dying in the streets. If John Lewis was sitting here, or Rip was sitting here, or Ben will tell you, they expected violence. And how can a Southern racist politician deal with that? First of all, he can't imagine it. And after 100 years, they can't imagine the law is going to change. And the Supreme Court has tried to change it in education, and nothing changes. All deliberate speed to that Southern politician meant slow, 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 never. So the politicians in the South couldn't believe what was happening to them. What Martin said to Bobby that day, "I must dramatize the evil. I must dramatize the corruption." That's his vision. And that's the vision that changes the society, because finally the national media does come in.
In our last segment, I asked Gene to engage us in a brief discussion of the role of an emerging new technology and the national media exposure that technology brought to the civil rights movement.
I talked about those 5 freedoms being coming to me the most fruition during the civil rights movement, and the press was really the follow to the first 4, where you had assembly and petition and speech and press. Television at that era. Today we're 24/7, cable, news is there, nightly newscasts are a feature, now some say a fading feature. You had 10 or 15 minutes, and they were all filmed. They tended to, because of the nature of it, you had no live coverage. You had film that had to be processed and flown, physically flown places. In the early 50s, you didn't even have coaxial cable, so you couldn't get images across the country. When you could, it really was New York and LA. There was a great reticence, I think, on the part of a lot of local newspapers who were very concerned, very often part of the local power structure, to report these things as breaking news. And then serendipitous, perhaps, television comes along. you begin to have network newscasts. And you see, I think, a very skillful use, this drama, this realization that what can go on, the use of fire hoses, the use of dogs, the use of authorities to suppress civil rights marchers, but with the beginning of what we would now call news gathering equipment, with all those physical hurdles to begin to get the news coming back. And I don't think it's an accident that New York was both a locus for television and newspaper coverage.
The decision to have students keep a journal of the directed study in lieu of writing a traditional term paper was one that we believed enhanced the learning experience. It was an ongoing exercise in writing, and it encouraged the discussion of every learning experience with a roommate or a group of fellow students at dinner or at the hotel at the end of the day. The assignment of journals also made the personal meaning of learning legal history and social history legitimate. Alfred North Whitehead's first observation in his great essay on the aims of education is that culture is activity of thought and receptiveness to beauty and humane feeling. Scraps of information have nothing to do with it. Perhaps more to the point of this directed study, he observes in that essay that the only use of a knowledge of the past is to equip us for the present. It was the point of the directed study to do this, and the journaling advanced this goal.
Looking at the journals over the last 2 years, seeing how, first of all, how seriously the students took this. In virtually every case, they decided not just to chronicle the day. I hope that they would be reflective. Frankly, I never dreamed they would be as reflective as they have been.
While riding to Birmingham, I had been fortunate to sit next to Reverend Benjamin Cox, one of the original Freedom Riders. Although I'm an African American from Mobile, Alabama, which is the second largest city in Alabama, I didn't know much about my home state's involvement and contributions to the civil rights movement.
In Birmingham, our intellectual and instinctive appreciation for the violence of Southern resistance to federal law and the realities of local law enforcement and judicial complicity in this resistance ratcheted up. Our first experience was hosted by Chris McNair, the father of Denise McNair, one of the 4 children killed in the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. On the way to Birmingham on the bus, the students had viewed Spike Lee's poignant documentary, 4 Little Girls. A wonderful dinner hosted by Mr. McNair was followed by a sharing of some stories by Bishop Calvin Woods and Professor Arsenault's interview with Catherine Burks Brooks, who as a 19-year-old young freedom rider was known for her insistence that the rides continue, even after she was personally threatened by Birmingham's chief law enforcement officer, Bull Connor.
The NAACP had been outlawed here in the state of Alabama. Dr. Shuttlesworth worked in the youth division. God gave him a vision to start a new organization, which he called a group of brethren together, about 11, and organized the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. We lined up by the hundreds and marched on the Jefferson County courthouse seeking to register to vote, but we just flooded the courthouse out. We wouldn't leave. We were just in there, and people were prepared to go to jail, and some were jailed. But the victory really was realized when children were recruited to participate in the demonstrations. They needed somebody to file a federal suit to get the children back in school. So I agreed to file the lawsuit in the name of one of my 3 daughters who were arrested.
Catherine was one of the first people that I interviewed when I began the book on the Freedom Rides. We spent a long bus ride together from Atlanta to Birmingham, and she was very gracious, and I was madly scribbling down.
The first place that I was arrested, I think it was it a White Castle? I think it was White Castle restaurant. And we went in to do, the regular things, have a seat, and they're not gonna move until the police come and get us. But we just spent overnight in jail, and I was arrested at another time, and this was in front of the theater. And then when I came home, and this was during the summer, I think it was during the summer, I was also arrested here. We were one of the first groups, I understand, to have had the type of success in the movement. And so they're in Nashville. And we were well organized and had been able to raise money. When we heard about what had happened to CORE here in Anderson and then on into Birmingham, and that CORE was going to give up the ride because they could no longer continue. And so we said no, that the ride must continue. And so we decided from right there that we would go on, and we called Reverend Shuttlesworth. We had no fear of what was going to happen. And one thing that we had decided early, and once you decide that you don't mind dying, then what can stop you?
I'm curious, I've heard you say this before, how did you get to that point at that early age?
Well, I've been bumping into white people for a long time, remember? And so maybe I just had evolved to that point. That's why I think that I was able to talk to Bull Connor the way I was able to talk to Bull. When we got here to Birmingham, of course, they didn't let us off the bus for some hours. And then they carried us to jail when we did get off the bus. Bull said for our protection. And came that, I think it was the next morning around, it must have been 1 o'clock in the morning. And saying that they was gonna take us back to Nashville. Of course, I told them no, that I was not going back to Nashville, and we had been taught to go limp if you don't want to participate. And so I went limp. Lucretia, she walked. I went limp. I was going to refuse to walk. And he had the 2 policemen to pick me up and to carry me to the car. I was on the front seat in the middle, and I was a driving Bull. And we had a conversation from the time we left Birmingham and when we got to Culmer. And and I'm thinking that, there's nothing I can do now, so I'm talking, and I'm thinking that I'm thinking that he's gonna take us back to Nashville, knowing that we're gonna just turn around and come back.
Visiting the Old Bethel Baptist Church allowed the students to reflect on the special and prominent role of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in the movement, and his courage in the face of the attempts on his life, including the bombing of his church and parsonage. Colonel Stone Johnson, a deacon and de facto bodyguard who was devoted to the protection of Reverend Shuttlesworth, and Professor Arsenault, presented an amazing experience in team teaching on the subject of this church and its particular place in movement history. Our visitation to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute was facilitated by co-founder Odessa Woolfolk, who began our academic experience with a classroom discussion of the role of women in the civil rights movement. Dr. Woolfolk combined true storytelling from personal and professional experiences with the recommendation of particular books about the role of women in the movement, skillfully folding readings into her lecture, including passages from Lanterns by Marion Wright Edelman, Going South by Deborah Schultz, and Deep in Our Hearts, the memoirs Constance Curry and 8 of her colleagues in the movement wrote.
The South was most resistant to women having authority in most institutions. I mean, it was just a part of our Southern fabric and our Southern culture. Zora Neale Hurston, and all of you probably read her in high school and college, wrote, Southern black women were the mules of the world. They did whatever needed doing. And at the time, in the 60s, we had a lot of women who were running organizations. Sororities, black sororities did civic and social work. We had women running church auxiliaries. So you had women who had leadership potential. But the guys who ran the movement organizations had women in a stereotypical role. But women did play in SNCC. Women played roles in that organization as well as in CORE. They had more serious jobs in those organizations than they did first in SCLC.
Following the classroom session, the students spent considerable time at the Institute itself, which, like the King Center, is a state-of-the-art multimedia environment dedicated to the examination of all aspects of the movement and Birmingham's character as the center of dysfunctional politics, segregationist-led law enforcement, and a home to a culture of bombing as a tactic of Southern resistance to racial integration. As a colleague of Dr. Woolfolk and participant in the Institute's civil rights programming, Professor Arsenault was able to orient the students to the design of the exhibit halls of the Institute, and the students enjoyed another visual learning experience of superior quality. The capstone experience in Birmingham was again especially poignant. Visiting the 16th Street Baptist Church, going inside it, being there. And then, the lifelike sculptures at Kelly Ingram Park, the site of Bull Connor's awful tactics, emphasized the importance of creating lasting visual reminders that the rule of law ultimately prevailed only because of the courage of the Direct Action Campaign. And this is a very important lesson for law students.
Legal scholars and civil rights historians all see the violent reaction to civil rights protests in Birmingham as a turning point in movement history. To visit Kelly Ingram Park and see a lifelike sculpture of one of Bull Connor's dogs attacking a child brought what I had read to life. It allowed me to visualize violence in the place where it had taken place. I had seen the documentary film of those events at Kelly Ingram Park, but I was now there, and that made it visual and personal.
One of Reverend Shuttlesworth's deacons showed us the very place at the old Bethel Baptist Church where the church building joined the parsonage, where the bomb targeting him went off. We were at that very place that we had seen in Eyes on the Prize. And at the 16th Street Baptist Church, we stood at the very place that a bomb killed Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. Being there leaves nothing to question. You just know.
there was actually a place where the rubber hit the road and there were human lives that were at risk. And that's what was important for me. When I took this trip, I could see that, yes, you know, cases and the law said that these were rights, but until people risked their lives over and over again, the law really didn't mean as much.
Well, after the riot at the bus station, everybody dispersed, and immediately the black community started gathering. King had already moved to Atlanta at that point. He came back. Abernathy was still pastor of this church. He was here. A lot of people gathered in this church, and the black community came here, and the church filled up. Meanwhile, outside, the mob that had rioted at the bus station, the mob came here and continued the riot, and there were the church was just full of people who were trapped in here overnight. And King and Abernathy went inside on the phone to Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, and Kennedy was on the phone to Governor Patterson. They had sent in 400 U.S. Marshals to try to keep order. It was not working. The riot was getting worse, and eventually, after a lot of arm twisting, Patterson finally did federalize or allow the National Guard to be federalized, and they came out then and put down the riot.
Whizzer White was essentially running the operations from the local Air Force base and coordinating the federal marshals. But the marshals, as you know from your reading, of course, were overrun, and you can try to imagine this without the police. Interesting to see if the police station had been there at the time, whether it would have made any difference or not. But Ripley Street was ground zero for most of the violence. About 3,000 people surrounding the church.
Our visit to Montgomery included the opportunity to have dinner with original veterans of the Montgomery bus boycott, including Miss Johnny Carr, a true legend in her time, a childhood friend of Rosa Parks, who has lived the story of the bus boycott and its legacy. She describes the Jim Crow days as very much separate, but never equal. She recalls the night she received a phone call from E.D. Nixon that Miss Parks had been arrested. And since that night and the year of the boycott of Montgomery's buses, she has continued her personal work on behalf of the Montgomery Improvement Association. At age 96, she thanked the students for their commitment to civil rights. To hear those words of thanks from Miss Carr herself on behalf of original MIA veterans who the students now knew made the students understand that their commitment was connected to the efforts of those who had made a historic decision in December of 1955. Although familiar with the practice of law, the students found the visitation of the Southern Poverty Law Center to be a very enlightening experience. The program, presented by Communications Liaison Penny Weaver, Legal Director Rhonda Brownstein, and Mark Potok, Director of the Intelligence Project, was especially effective because we were at the Southern Poverty Law Center and felt a part of the energy and commitment of their work. Following a presentation of the center's history and the shift in the way the center's legal department carries out its mission, Ms. Brownstein discussed the expanded scope of the center's efforts while continuing to pursue civil litigation against hate groups through the effective application of principles of vicarious liability. Ms. Brownstein described in some detail the center's immigrant justice program and its work to advance farm worker rights, as well as its juvenile justice and special education practice, which seeks to reform the extent to which juveniles are treated as adults within the criminal justice system of many states, and which also seeks to fashion administrative and judicial alternatives to an emerging school-to-prison experience for many children of color, poor children, and children with emotional disabilities.
You know, back when Morris Dees and Joe Levin founded the Southern Poverty Law Center, it was right in sort of the throes of the civil rights era, a little bit after that, but where the law was still really at the infancy of developing constitutional and civil rights law. And so the big cases were being brought, whether they were individual cases that were setting a precedent or if they were class action lawsuits. That stuff was really going on in a big way, and there were opportunities to make a real difference through the federal courts and through the federal judges who were ready, willing, and able to start changing things. When I came on the scene in the mid-'80s, and I came here first in 1986, I think things were already starting to shift, and first of all, a lot of the big cases, a lot of the big struggles and the precedents were already set, number one. But number two is the federal courts started changing. We at the Southern Poverty Law Center have really shifted away from litigation. Not that we don't still bring it, but it used to be not only when I came here as a law fellow right out of law school in 1986, but when I came back in 1995, which was only 12 years ago, all we did was federal litigation in 1995 in terms of a legal department. We brought lawsuits. And we were still looking for those cases where we could make a difference. We started realizing that if we wanted to make change for people, the courtroom had to be just one tool, and there had to be other tools that we were using. It doesn't mean that we're not geared at changing the law, or changing the legal system, or changing the system, but it was no longer simply about let's file a lawsuit. There are still some areas where litigation can still be powerful. In our Immigrant Justice Project that we started 3 years ago, when we started, sort of realizing that obviously the immigration issue is so important, and it is the new civil rights issue in some ways.
Mark Potock's explanation of the Center's Intelligence Project allowed students to appreciate the uniqueness of the center as an interdisciplinary practice. Mr. Potock, a former investigative reporter, reviewed the history of the project and engaged the students in a discussion of its current role as both providing investigative support for the center's legal work and, more prominently, a broad spectrum of investigative journalism for the purpose of exposing and combating the activities of hate groups. Mr. Potock reviewed the origins and fundamental beliefs of modern hate groups and the relative sophistication of their activities, including the influence of white power music and their exploitation of the internet. Mr. Potock engaged the students in a discussion of the use of investigative journalism as an effective means, in combination with selective litigation, of bringing hate groups to justice and diminishing or eliminating their threat to those who are the targets of neo-Nazi, Aryan, or other white supremacist philosophy. While the Center's website and the Intelligence Project's magazine provide an excellent ongoing description of its work, having the opportunity to meet Mark Potock allowed students an inside look at the deep sense of justice which drives this special aspect of the Center's practice. Following our classroom session, the students were able to view the defining visual images throughout the center's lobby and hallways and to add their names to the center's wall of tolerance. Our capstone experience at the Southern Poverty Law Center was the visitation of the National Civil Rights Memorial. Designed by Maya Lin, the brilliant young designer of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the National Civil Rights Memorial allowed students to feel a closeness to those who had given their lives in the struggle for civil rights and strengthened their personal commitment to do something as lawyers to advance the cause of civil rights. On the occasion of the dedication of the memorial, Maya Lin observed, like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the Civil Rights Memorial invites visitors to touch the engraved names. The memorial is a contemplative area, a place to remember the movement, to honor those killed during the struggle, to appreciate how far the country has come in its quest for equality, and to consider how far it has to go. While in Montgomery, we were privileged to visit the courtroom of Judge Frank Johnson, Jr., the subject of Professor Bass's award-winning biography, Taming the Storm. Sitting in the beautiful and accurately restored courtroom where Judge Johnson had considered some of the most important petitions in the movement's legal history, we shared a special conversation with his successor, Judge Myron Thompson. Not just about Judge Johnson, but the last century of civil rights discourse and the influence of that dialogue on the law which fulfilled the principles announced in Brown.
Well, I've been very fortunate over the last 10 years or so to work on a number of museum projects. I mean, civil rights research, commemoration has become a major force, I think, thankfully. But I'm very proud of a smaller museum, the Rosa Parks Museum, which I was one of the primary consultants. And we, I had a lot of challenges there to try to make this story come alive, to make this a place where people would want to come and come again. Remembering back to all the decisions we had to make about which photograph to choose and how much text to put on the wall and how to design the bus exhibit to give them a kind of close connection to Rosa Parks and to E.D. Nixon and to keep everything in proportion. To a large extent, the sequence of the tour is determined by geography. So I think it's really just good fortune that Selma for us, for our students, for the tour, comes after Montgomery. In Birmingham and Montgomery, it's a pretty intense experience for them, but they're seeing these very polished, in some cases high-tech presentations. And then you come to Selma, and you see something done, absolutely out of the grassroots, coming out of some people who were actually involved on Bloody Sunday and in the voting rights marches from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, others who were just children then, but who witnessed it. It's kind of intergenerational, it seems to me, activity or effort on the parts of people in Selma. They have created what they think is, and I think many people agree, is a meaningful reconstruction of what happened there.
Having discussed the historical readings and the decisions of the Fifth Circuit and U.S. Supreme Court, which bookended the terrible police attacks on voting rights marchers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the first Sunday in March of 1965, we gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church and walked across the Pettus Bridge. As students of the subject know, many of those who were there on Bloody Sunday returned to Brown Chapel on the first Sunday in March of each year to honor Jimmy Lee Jackson, Reverend James Reeb, and others who gave their lives in Selma and elsewhere in the struggle for civil rights. The Supreme Court's decision on the Monday after Bloody Sunday and President Johnson's message to Congress a week later made these events the call for Congress to fulfill what President Johnson called the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy.
The issue was never dollars, the issue is dignity. The issue is self-worth. The issue is the sacredness of human personality. That's the hopeful end result and concern of both law and movement. And in fact, most of the great laws on the books for common people were based upon the worth of mankind, religious, spiritual, social, issues and insights and understandings. And if we don't start there, the law becomes unworthy.
I would say the importance of the course to law students is its interdisciplinary nature. It places cases like Brown versus Board of Education and all the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decisions that followed Brown in a broader historical context.
The directed study added experience and interaction to my readings. For law students, oral tradition is unique. This experience added so much to my growth, not only as a student, but as an individual. It's easy for law students to lose sight of the true power of the law and the role of the law in social change.
It took the National Guard to protect James Meredith when he tried to enroll for classes at the formerly all-white University of Mississippi. Years later, when Meredith was invited back to speak to students at the university about that experience, a student asked him what was different about the university and the students this time around. Meredith replied, nothing. The students here today would have thrown rocks at me then, and the students then would have applauded me today. In reading those words of James Meredith, I realized we cannot all be products of our time. Some of us must go against the grain. When I took the civil rights trip in the summer of 2006, I met many people who went against the grain.
I'm not sure if I can articulate what the academic benefit is to shaking the hand of Chris McNair or putting my hand on Rosa Parks' name at the Civil Rights Memorial, just as she did when the memorial opened. I just know it changed my life.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.